The beginning of the movie shows a father taking care of his son and daughter. Soon, they receive a female guest named Giselle, who claims to be the champion model in town. Giselle intends to recruit the father's two children to become child models. Initially, the father is hesitant as he's meeting Giselle for the first time. However, Giselle keeps trying to convince him, and eventually, he allows Giselle to recruit his two children. On that day, Giselle asks the father to take his two children to a motel in the city for an immediate photo session. However, upon arrival, the father is not allowed to enter the room to avoid disturbing the concentration of the potential child models. In the end, Giselle asks the father to go home and pick up his children again at 7 p.m. After that, the photo session begins and all the children seem very happy, because soon they will become models. In the evening, precisely at 7 p.m., the father of the two children returns to the motel to pick up his kids. However, to his surprise, the motel room is empty with no one inside. Panicking, he runs around seeking help, but unfortunately, he doesn't find anyone. It can be confirmed that his two children have been kidnapped. The scene shifts to the police, who have formed a special team to handle the rising cases of child kidnappings in the country. It's revealed that, in less than a month, dozens of young children have been abducted. These children are being trafficked for sex slavery, prompting the police to establish this special team. The team is led by a man named Tim Ballard. Currently, Tim and his team are preparing to apprehend a man named Oshinsky, suspected of being a child predator. And as Oshinsky is engrossed in using the computer, Tim and his team conduct a raid. After successfully capturing Oshinsky, Tim immediately opens the data on Oshinsky's computer. Here, Tim sheds tears as he watches a video of Oshinsky engaging in inappropriate acts with his victims. Unable to contain his emotions, Tim goes to Oshinsky's cell. However, instead of attacking him, Tim engages in a conversation while enjoying a cigarette. Tim pretends to confess that he, too, is a man like Oshinsky, a child predator. Falling for the deception, Oshinsky immediately believes Tim is one of his kind. The next day, Tim asks for permission from his superiors to release Oshinsky for a week. Tim promises that he will later put Oshinsky back in jail because he has his own plan to capture Oshinsky's friends who are still at large. His trusting superior grants Tim permission. On that day, Tim immediately releases Oshinsky and takes him to a cafe for a chat. Here, Tim promises to lighten Oshinsky's punishment as long as he provides one child as an offering. Oshinsky, already trusting Tim, agrees to give one child, but before that, he needs to visit one of his accomplices. Tim easily allows Oshinsky to leave, unaware that he is being remotely monitored by undercover police. As it turns out, Oshinsky meets his accomplice and requests one small child as an offering for Tim, whom he considers deviant like himself. Oshinsky's accomplice agrees to fulfill the request, but will provide the child the next day at the Mexico border. Afterward, Oshinsky returns to Tim and gives him a book. When opened, it contains photos of a young boy kidnapped by Giselle at the beginning of the film. Oshinsky explains that this child will be given to Tim, but he has to wait until tomorrow and pick him up at the Mexico border. Once Tim feels he has enough information from Oshinsky, he immediately chokes him, and the police arrive promptly to arrest Oshinsky again. Before leaving, Tim states that he only pretended to get information and that now, cursed beings like Oshinsky will face the death penalty soon. The next day, Tim is at the Mexico border, waiting for Oshinsky's accomplice, who promised to bring a child. Shortly after, the accomplice arrives with the child, and Tim quickly apprehends him. Tim then approaches the frightened child named Miguel, and assures him that he is not a bad person and is there to save him. Tim takes Miguel to the hospital for a checkup, where the doctor confirms that Miguel is physically fine but has experienced trauma. Tim then invites Miguel to dinner, sensing that Miguel hasn't eaten. Here, Tim asks Miguel to share the story of how he was kidnapped. Miguel explains that he and his sister were offered a modeling opportunity, but after the photo session, they were taken to a port intending to go to Colombia. Luckily, before the ship departed, one of Oshinsky's accomplices was looking for a child, and Miguel was chosen, leading him to the Mexico border. Miguel pleads with Tim to save his sister and the other kidnapped children. He also gives Tim a lucky necklace, believing that if Tim keeps it, he will never fail in his missions. Upon hearing this, Tim promises to rescue Miguel's sister and the others, and capture all the human trafficking syndicates. The next day, Tim takes Miguel to the airport, where Miguel's father is anxiously waiting. Although Miguel has been successfully rescued, his father is still saddened because his daughter has not been saved yet. Before parting ways, Miguel hugs Tim and asks him to bring his sister home soon. Tim then goes to the prison to confront Oshinsky's friend, who was arrested the day before. Here, Tim threatens to move the man to an extremely harsh prison if he doesn't provide information about who kidnapped Miguel and the other children. The frightened man eventually reveals that Miguel and his sister were kidnapped by a woman named Caviezel, and she is currently in Colombia. He even provides a sketch of Giselle's face. Upon learning this information, Tim immediately seeks permission from his superiors to go to Colombia to rescue Miguel's sister and the other children and capture Caviezel and her syndicate. However, his superior does not allow Tim to go, citing the difficulty of obtaining the necessary permits to capture someone in another country. Tim continues to plead, even shedding tears as his heart breaks seeing innocent children treated this way. The reluctant boss eventually grants Tim permission, but only for 7 days and without official authorization from the Minister of Defense. Grateful, Tim thanks him and promises to return within 7 days. On that day, Tim hastily departs for Colombia. Upon arrival, Tim is welcomed by George, his old friend and a police captain. George immediately takes Tim to meet one of his acquaintances. It turns out that George introduces Tim to a former mafia boss named Vampiro. It's revealed that Vampiro used to be the most brutal drug mafia boss. However, he has now repented and uses all the money from his drug trade to buy trafficked children. Vampiro then liberates these children as a form of redemption for his past sins. And because of this shared goal, George introduces Tim to Vampiro. Vampiro then asks Tim to change his clothes because his current appearance looks too much like a special agent. If Tim wants to capture human traffickers, he needs to dress like an addict, gangster, or mafia boss to convince them. Tim then inquires if Vampiro is familiar with a woman named Caviezel, as she is the one who kidnapped several children in America. Vampiro responds that he will reveal everything at his home. Eventually, Tim and George are taken to Vampiro's house. Upon arrival, Vampiro explains that Caviezel used to be a champion model, but she turned to kidnapping children when her modeling career declined. Caviezel is extremely cautious and refuses to do business with unfamiliar individuals. This poses a challenge for Tim, as getting close to her would be difficult. The next day, Tim contacts Vampiro with a new idea. He suggests opening a brothel because it would attract syndicates like Caviezel who sell children. Once all the children are in their hands, they can capture these traffickers. Vampiro agrees with Tim's idea, but it will certainly require a lot of money. Later in the day, Tim contacts a wealthy businessman named Pablo, who often helps the police. Tim intends to make Pablo his investor. Pablo, however, doesn't immediately agree and asks Tim to meet him to discuss the details of his plan. On the other hand, Vampiro approaches a syndicate acquaintance named El Calicas to inform him that he and Tim are opening a brothel. Vampiro hopes Calicas will join them and persuade other syndicates to join as well. And Tim is about to arrive to explain the details to Calicas. Soon Tim arrives and announces that they will establish a brothel in an upscale location called Cartagena. The plan is to open the place in a week, and Tim hopes Calicas will convince other syndicates to join. Hearing this, El Calicas is immediately astonished because the island is highly elite, and he willingly agrees to join Tim. After that, Calicas promptly leaves to gather other syndicates, including Caviezel. Calicas asks Caviezel to provide 50 children as the first phase of their new business. Caviezel and the other syndicates are thrilled and agree to join as well. Tim himself seems puzzled because his investor, Pablo, might not be willing to invest in him. The next day, Tim is contacted by his superior. The boss asks Tim to return to America immediately because it has been 8 days since Tim arrived in Colombia. If Tim doesn't return, the boss will be forced to fire him, because if this illegal mission is exposed, the American police will face severe sanctions. Upon hearing this, Tim can only sigh while turning off his phone. Not long after that, Tim goes to Vampiro to seek advice. Should he go back home or continue with his mission here? Vampiro simply responds that all the decisions are in Tim's hands. However, even if Tim chooses not to pursue this mission, Vampiro will continue it on his own. The next day, Tim contacts his superior. Surprisingly, Tim decides to resign from the police force to carry out this mission. He does all of this because his determination is firm. He wants to eradicate all human trafficking syndicates. After that, Tim visits Pablo to discuss his plan. Tim honestly states that he plans to open a brothel on Cartagena Island. However, it's all a trap to capture human trafficking syndicates and save the 50 children they will bring. For this, Tim needs funding from Pablo because the costs are quite high. But Tim promises that if all the syndicates are captured, all of Pablo's money will be returned. After hearing Tim's explanation, unfortunately, Pablo disagrees because he's afraid he won't get his money back, and Pablo leaves Tim behind. But when Pablo is in the car, it turns out Tim slipped in a photo, the picture of Miguel's sister, the little child Tim saved. The photo also states that the abuse of children must be stopped immediately. From this point on, Pablo's heart is moved, and he immediately approaches Tim to agree. The next day, Tim Vampiro and Pablo immediately strategize and rent Cartagena Island to trap the syndicates. Tim also collaborates with George, the Colombian police captain, to capture all the syndicates when they gather on Cartagena Island. The next day arrives when Tim and Vampiro will open the brothel. Before the syndicates arrive, George and his team are seen ready to arrest them all. A few hours later, Giselle, Alcalicus, and several other syndicates arrive, bringing 54 children with them. They immediately celebrate in the new establishment, but shortly after that, to their surprise, George and his team arrive and raid them all. In the end, all 54 children were successfully rescued, and the syndicates, including Giselle and Alcalicus, were captured. However, Tim is still not satisfied because the older sister of Miguel, whom he's been looking for, is not among the rescued children. Upon hearing this, George promises to interrogate all the captured syndicates to gather information on the whereabouts of Miguel's older sister. The next day, George approached Tim and Vampiro, explaining that he had interrogated all the syndicates the night before. George revealed that Miguel's sister had been sold to a former soldier who now leads a rebel group in a remote village in the middle of the forest. No one dares to enter that village, so George suggested that Tim should avoid going there. Vampiro, being a former mafia boss, is familiar with the village and proposes a plan for them to enter. They would disguise themselves as medical personnel providing free treatment for all the local residents. This is the only way they can gain entry since there are no doctors there. Excited by this plan, Tim decides to go to the village the next day. The next day, Tim was accompanied by Vampiro and George to go to the remote village. However, George and Vampiro would only wait for Tim at the border. If they both entered, the rebel leader would surely recognize them. Tim, Vampiro, and George spent the night on the riverbank at the border before Tim started his mission the next morning. In the morning, Vampiro accompanied Tim to navigate the river using a boat. However, halfway through the journey, they were surrounded by a rebel group that immediately stopped their boat. Fortunately, the rebels did not recognize Vampiro, so Tim quickly explained that they were medical personnel providing free treatment to the local residents. Hearing this, the rebel group only allowed one person to enter, so Tim volunteered. In the end, Tim was taken by them while Vampiro returned to the riverbank at the border. Upon arriving, Tim noticed numerous slaves forced to harvest coca leaves. Before long, he encountered the rebel leader who had purchased Miguel's sister. The rebel leader inquired about Tim's purpose for being there. Tim handed over his fake assignment letter, claiming he was ordered to provide free medical treatment to all villagers. However, the rebel leader burned the letter, insisting that the villagers didn't need any medical assistance. Tim was promptly expelled, with a clear warning that returning would jeopardize his life. As Tim was leaving, he coincidentally crossed paths with a young girl who turns out to be Miguel's sister. Tim signaled to her that he would come to rescue her. Subsequently, Tim hid, waiting for the night to initiate his plan. As night fell, Tim watched over the rebel leader hosting a party. Deeming the situation safe, he stealthily slipped into Miguel's sister's room and woke her up. However, the child screamed, thinking Tim was there to harm her. The scream reached the rebel leader's ears, prompting him to enter and investigate. Luckily, Tim had already hidden under the bed, and when the rebel leader arrived, Miguel's sister claimed she was merely having a bad dream. Then the rebel leader intended to do something inappropriate to Miguel's sister. Tim, witnessing this, could no longer contain his emotions and attacked the rebel leader. After dealing with the rebel leader, Tim immediately took Miguel's sister away from the village. Shortly after, the rebel followers realized their leader had been taken down by Tim, prompting them to rush towards the river to pursue him. Fortunately, Tim had boarded a boat and headed to the border riverbank. In the end, Tim successfully reached the border riverbank and quickly fled in a car with George and Vampiro. Tim was overjoyed because he had successfully rescued Miguel's sister from the child predator. The next day, Miguel's sister was seen reuniting with Miguel and their father. They were seen tearfully embracing each other after surviving the cruel ordeal. Tim, however, didn't stop there, as he continued to capture human trafficking syndicates even though he was no longer working in the police force. In the end, the film showed Tim returning to America and proposing international cooperation laws to capture more of these wretched individuals. Then the movie finally ended. So, what do you think of this true story adapted movie? Did you enjoy the recap? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. One like and subscribe is highly appreciated. Share this video to your friends and family too. And that's about it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next videos.